Hey, welcome and thank you for joining us on Headline Busters, brought to you by The Point. I'm Li Qiuyan, sitting in for Liu Xin. In this series, I dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to our guests to compensate for the missing pieces of the puzzle. This week, our COVID-19 coverage continues. The pandemic is picking up pace. As of March the 26th, 462,684 confirmed cases have been reported globally, and the number of deaths has soared past 20,000, according to the World Health Organization. At this point, the virus has touched nearly every single person on this planet in some way. Sick loved ones, canceled plans, economic setbacks. This is a lot of sadness, fear, and also anger. And with over 85,000 confirmed cases reported on March the 27th, according to Johns Hopkins University, the U.S. is coming to terms with its own dire situation. After denying the severity of the threat for weeks, U.S. President Donald Trump has come under fire for doing too little too late. Instead of leading his country through this difficult time, he's looking for someone else to blame. Enter China. Last week, Trump started referring to COVID-19 as the quote-unquote Chinese virus. He's also said he wishes China had informed the U.S. about the coronavirus sooner. But then this week, he flip-flopped, saying he's backing away from using the term, presumably after being criticized both at home and abroad. Well, who knows what's next? But regardless, his administration hasn't stopped. Just this week, the U.S. Embassy in China referred to the Wuhan virus in a post on its Weibo account. China's foreign ministry fired back over Twitter. A spokesperson said on January the 15th, the U.S. State Department notified Americans in China U.S. CDC's warning about the coronavirus and now blamed China for the delay. Seriously? And the lying and slander won't make the U.S. great, nor will it make up for the lost time. Unfortunately, a war of words has erupted at a time when nations should be coming together to fight a common enemy. Another spokesperson put it this way.
The virus knows no borders and ethnicity. It can only be defeated by the concerted efforts of all mankind. COVID-19 has taken footholds and is rapidly spreading in many parts of the world. We hope that the U.S. will work with China and the larger international community to jointly fight against the pandemic and safeguard the global public health security.
And since many media are focusing on this escalating blame game between China and the U.S., I want to ask, what role are they playing? Are they steering their readers in a certain direction by choosing sides? Why does it matter? Our first example appears in the Times. On March the 22nd, the British paper published the article, "Coronavirus Blame Game Widens Rift Between Donald Trump and Furious China." Well, it says anti-U.S. conspiracy theories in response to the president's Wuhan flu jibes look set to push relations back still further. 2 points here. First, the headline labels China as furious. That very well might be the case, and with just cause. But is it the job of the journalist to do so, literally sprinkle adjectives in a headline? It could read just as easily as widens rift between furious Trump and China. Or why not say widens rift between xenophobic Trump and China? If you are going to inject opinions into news headlines, then at least use adjectives for both sides, not just one. And second, the president's Wuhan flu jibes look set to push relations back still further. Jibes are like taunts or teasing. Using the word in this context is irresponsible, especially for a term that medical experts and the WHO have determined is not only inaccurate, but also stigmatizing. Now, given the tidal wave of attacks against Asians around the world since COVID-19 started spreading, is now really the time to jibe, taunt, or tease China? Let's let more gravity to the headline, please. But I also see some problems in the article itself when it describes China's response to Trump and his allies repeatedly referring to the disease as the Chinese virus or Wuhan flu. It says Chinese officials have countered with the internet conspiracy theory that the virus was brought to Wuhan by American soldiers competing in a military sports competition there last year. It adds that the speculation was unfounded, with an expert calling China's tactics, quote, information warfare. But when it describes how Thom, a Republican senator in the U.S., promoted the idea that the virus may have originated in an accidental leak from a biowarfare lab in Wuhan, an idea that's clearly been debunked by scientists, the article just calls it a theory, not a conspiracy theory. It doesn't bother to say the theory has been disproven by science and is part of a bigger political ploy. So if you are going to call out unfounded theories, fine, but be consistent. Don't let a blatant conspiracy theory off the hook here. And our next piece comes from the Financial Times. On March 24th, it published the article From Cover-Up to Global Donor, China's Soft Power Plays. It says, with its economy showing signs of life, Beijing is aiming to restore its reputation damaged by coronavirus. Now, here we see how media can take a positive China story and spin it into something sinister and suspicious. The headline totally misses the point. Yes, the situation has stabilized here in China, and China's doing what it can to help other countries, be it supplying and donating supplies, test kits, face masks, and teams of medical professionals. The Chinese government announced it's providing emergency assistance to over 80 countries, as well as international and regional organizations such as the WHO and African Union. Now, China has also contributed $20 million to the WHO to support its international cooperation in fighting the epidemic. But the article dismisses China's efforts, no matter what they are, as a much-needed propaganda boost for Beijing. When the Serbian president asked for China's assistance in battling the disease, the article says the public appeal was just what China had been looking for, an opportunity to start reframing its role from that of the country that accelerated the virus's spread through cover-ups to that of the magnanimous global power offering leadership at a time of panic and peril in much of the rest of the world. It would be worth mentioning China's position in all this, right? Chinese President Xi Jinping at Thursday's extraordinary G20 Leaders Summit said, at such a moment, it is imperative for the international community to strengthen confidence, act with unity, and work together in a collective response. But I guess this piece of the puzzle just didn't fit into this article's agenda. Well, if China stands idly by and does nothing, it's bad, selfish, insular. But if China does something good for the world, well, then there must be a bad reason behind it. Blame China no matter what seems to be the mission in some media. But luckily, not all media, as we see in our last example this week. CNN published the article Blame Game Escalates Between U.S. and China Over Coronavirus Disinformation on March the 25th. Here we see a straightforward and neutral headline, not about U.S. and furious China, but about grievances on both sides. Now, the article says, in addition to waging war on coronavirus at home, President Donald Trump's administration is engaged in another battle as the U.S. and China fight to shape the narrative about the pandemic's origins. It includes quotes and examples from both sides of the China-U.S. blame game. It also explores the political motivation behind Trump's changing tone and how the use of his offensive term has drawn pushback from health officials who say the description is misleading and xenophobic. Well, sure, there are plenty of points in the article I might not agree with, but at least the coverage comes across as fair. So if media are going to report on the blame game, okay, but at least play it straight rather than with loaded dice. Now, we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, I'll talk to my guests about media's role as referee in this COVID-19 blame game, and also the impact of some major breaking developments in this global fight. Stay with us. Welcome back to Headline Buster. We're now talking about the media's coverage of the COVID-19 blame game between China and the U.S. and the bigger picture of reporting on China's fight against the disease. For that, I'm now joined by Thom Brooks, Dean and Professor of Law and Government at Durham Law School via Skype in Durham, UK. And Mr. Wang, chief reporter at the Global Times here in Beijing. And also in Beijing, Einar Tangen, our current affairs commentator. Great to see you all. So before we dive into today's topic, I want to talk about some big developments here. China on Thursday announced it's temporarily suspending entry of some foreigners in light of the rapid spread of the virus. What's interesting about this development from the international media's perspective, Einar?
Well, the international media says that China is basically closing the door, putting up the wall. But the fact is China is just limiting the number of people who can come in. It's one flight per airline, per destination. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that there's just so much capacity to handle it. Right now, there are thousands of people who are waiting in their quarantine areas. And it's a logistical issue, in addition to the fact that, letting more people in who do have the virus is just another secondary threat to having something happen here, despite all of the precautions.
And Mr. Wang, so why do you think China is putting up this travel restriction only now?
I think it's pretty clear, because also from the foreign media coverage of this move is that China, because if we remember, we remember that when the U.S. announced the restrictions, China criticized that. So some of the foreign media making a fuss about China's move, saying that this is China against its own principles. But if we read through the statement yesterday, this is a very hard decision, and the Chinese, foreign ministry made it very clear that we came to this decision very, very hard, and this was last resort. But, the situation is that this coronavirus has spread across the globe, and that it has, put extra pressure on China's anti-epidemic efforts. It's very different from when, China was dealing with this epidemic at home, and then all the countries prematurely, making all these restrictions uncoordinated, not to mention, So I think I would make that distinction, and that's what makes the fuss. But it is absolutely necessary when it comes to the move, to handle this, what we call imported cases, because there's a surge in those numbers.
Yeah, we are seeing a surge in imported cases. And Mr. Brooks, let me bring you into the discussion. Now, the U.S. surpassed China in the number of reported coronavirus cases on Thursday, with the latest tally around 85,000 cases, as we mentioned earlier. The apex might still be weeks away. So how will this surge in reported cases, do you think, in the U.S. change the rhetoric coming out from Washington, especially in terms of China and this blame game we've been talking about?
Well, I think it will have a potentially very profound effect. At the moment, President Trump seems to be saying this is something like a foreign invasion, that whatever problem there is isn't really his fault. Don't look at him. He keeps praising, bizarrely, how great his administration he thinks is handling all this, while there's very serious problems are beginning to emerge all over the U.S. Every state now has been affected by it. I think, that's where he is right now. As things escalate, and probably will very quickly in the United States, where there is not universal health care, and a lot of people will be potentially in a very difficult situation on multiple fronts, I think his rhetoric will have to change. And I think that, and the public mood is very certain to change as well. Don't forget, this is a re-election year for President Trump, and I'm sure his mind is very much on that as well. So a very high-stakes game for him to be playing right now that he shouldn't be playing.
Yeah, we are having some comments from our viewers. Let's take a look at that. This is from Twitter. So Twitter user Alistair Lim said earlier Trump had been very vocal with his rhetorics about the coronavirus and calling it Chinese virus, but lately he has changed his tone to a kinder one. Has the damage been done? Einar, what do you think? U.S. President Trump's tone toward China keeps wavering in all this.
Well, it goes up and down, but I mean, you have to remember earlier this week his administration was trying to include Wuhan virus in the G7, which he hosted, and all the nations, as said no, leaving the U.S. alone, and the communique not reflecting it. He also just in the last few hours, his administration has announced that they're going to take action, particularly against CCTV, any journalists in the U.S. who they now have labeled as spies. and then also including academics and students and diplomats in this. So on one hand, he had a conversation with Xi Jinping in which it seemed to go well. He softened his tone, but at the same time, his administration is out there still promoting this anti-China rhetoric. Remember, this is all about his election. He needs China as something to blame so that no one looks at the incompetence of his handling of this coronavirus.
It's interesting to look how he reversed his statements. At first, he praised China for its efforts in containing the virus. Then he started calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus. But then he seemingly backed away from using the term. Mr. Wang, so let me bring into this. Why the inconsistency? Is he confused?
I think this is quite interesting also because just, today that he had a conversation with Chinese President Xi Jinping where they spoke about, potential cooperation. And in China, many people rate this as, just a temporary move that, under heavy fire back in the United States, he has to make a move that, seeking possibly China's help with regard to medical supplies. However, no one in Beijing, people I've speaking with, including people at the, officials, no one is taking this as a truce or as, some turning point between the war of words, as you described, between China and U.S. But overall, I think we call this a blame game, but we have to be careful. I think this is not the situation here because blame game implies that both sides are blaming each other for the virus. If you read through the Chinese official statements, that's not what China is doing. It's about pushing back the U.S. blames, scapegoating. It's not about China blaming the U.S. for the coronavirus. The virus is nobody's fault. I think everybody has to come to the same page on that before we move forward to make any coordinated, cooperation to contain this globally.
Mr. Brooks, what do you make of what's being said there? I mean, an expert we mentioned earlier in one of the articles called it information warfare. What would you call it? What's the bigger picture context behind this finger pointing?
Well, I think what's going on in the United States is simply just propaganda. It's a lot of President Trump, a lot of self-celebration. Look how wonderful my administration is. We've got, he said in January, oh, we've got everything under control. They clearly do not. There's a lockdown in some states, but not even in most, and certainly not all. It's not clear that that's going to be happening anytime soon. And states like New York, very close to where I was raised, is in a very serious situation right now, and the president is denying reality on the ground, the need for extra ventilators, the need for extra help and support, and so on. State governors can only do so much in the United States without federal support and help, and I think that at the end of the day, if things really do explode as people expect it, unfortunately, and very tragically will in the United States, the president can blame whoever he wants for the situation he finds himself in. But I think voters and others will rightly come to a very negative verdict on his administration if not only livelihoods are lost, but if lives are lost because of his finger-pointing and his constant referring to fake news and ridiculous conspiracy theories.
Let's take a look at another comment from our viewer. So this is also from Twitter. Benjel says China's message should be clear and simple. Don't let your states do what the Wuhan government did. Learn from our mistakes, experience. I fear now not only we have not learned, we're now doubling down on stupidity to keep the economy alive by killing people. Einar, what do you think?
Well, I don't agree. I think there's some feeling that sinking to Donald Trump's level and putting forth even in a question form this idea that there was some conspiracy or something like that, or an open-ended question. I think it's best. China has a very, very strong argument in the facts. China has, so far, been able to contain. I mean, we've had days and days where there have been no new internal new cases. So I think China needs to just rely on the facts and not get involved with Donald Trump on his level, because that just empowers that group they can then say, well, we can spin our theories because somebody in China spun a theory that they had. And this is not the way to go. I mean, Xi Jinping he laid out at the G20 a very, very clear program which says rely on scientists. Let's have a global response to not only the health side of this, but the economic side. And the last part was there should be in the hands of the health community and the experts, not being politicized. And I think this is the most important point. We're dealing with facts here. A virus is not a political entity, and people should not try to make it that. And unfortunately, a lot of people on the internet are taking their fear and they're putting it into forms where they're saying that, you know, people are dying because of inaction or something like that. That's not the issue. It's really about leadership at this point.
Keeping rhetorics in check, that's very important, but unfortunately not a lot of media are doing their job responsibly. Mr. Brooks, how do you look at media's role in telling these kind of stories? For example, there's an article. Is the article responsible for debunking a conspiracy theory here, such as the U.S. politician's suggestion that the virus leaked from a biowarfare lab in Wuhan?
Well, I think, you know, there's, on the one hand, I think when you have ridiculous conspiracy theories, it's important to ensure that the facts are, you know, are there for all to see, and that such ridiculousness is shown for what it is. On the other hand, talking too much and at length about certain conspiracy things can also give some of that legs. I mean, one of the stories that really kind of took me was that how medical scientists in Wuhan had written in English to The Lancet, one of the world's top medical journals, to note that a new virus had been found, that it had a different effect on people, seemed to be much more deadly than common influenza, and basically a warning to the West that this was coming your way. And it's been a series of debates here in the United Kingdom, where I am, about that the government here was warned about this in English, in its top medical journal, that this was coming, and yet decided not to act immediately on this. I take the point that I think there is a matter of leadership here, and you're seeing leadership in some places and not enough in others. There are lessons surely for everyone, I suppose, and there's always something differently one might do in response to things. Global pandemics are thankfully not something that happen every year or frequently. Long may that be the case. That said, you know, there is a need for journalists to expose the facts. There is a need to bring things to light. I think we are beginning to see some more of that. Although, of course, yes, a lot of Washington Post, others might be saying one thing at one moment, now saying something else. I suppose I'm just grateful that more and more are coming to terms that this, viruses carry no passports, that a lot of the conspiracy theories are just that. This is a very serious pandemic that requires effective government action. Doesn't matter what culture or other system one has. What does matter is protecting the public, saving lives, and that this is something that we're all going to be in together, one way or another. And the more that countries can rally together in support of one another in a common cause of saving lives, the better, rather than any kind of finger-pointing exercises that we're seeing from Trump and some other irresponsible leaders.
Right. And this is the first time any of us have experienced this kind of pandemic in this kind of media climate. Einar, you've been in this media industry, observing this industry for a very long time. I mean, how is the virus changing the way media reports on the news and the way readers consume news?
Well, it's actually just amplifying some underlying ugliness that's been there for a while. If you go back to 2016, and you start looking at the number of negative stories. Now, China hasn't changed anything. There's nothing different or ground breaking. There's no watershed in 2016. But the number of negative stories started to double in terms of being, using pejorative sentences, the kind of headlines that you were just outlining in the very beginning of this podcast. So at that, people are now in this position where they think China is evil, that they stole jobs and all this type of thing. So then this pandemic comes along, and it's very easy to slide into this idea that, yes, China is the evil one, to bring up all of these old stereotypes that somehow Chinese people carry disease, that it's not the white people who do it. Now, the fact is that Europeans were the center of almost all of the most virulent outbreaks that there were throughout history. I mean, 90% of the Americas were wiped out by all the diseases that were brought to them. You know, one still has that image of these plague-laden blankets being traded to the Indians in exchange for Manhattan. They knew fully well that these blankets could not be used. They should have been burned. Instead, they were traded for land. This type of things. But it's not useful to go back into history and do all of these things. So what difference does it make? We have to deal with the situation that we have now. And unfortunately, the press has been co-opted in many instances where they have decided that sensationalizing hatred or distrust of China is somehow good for their business. I don't think they understand that it's really an indictment of their professionalism.
So when can we see both the U.S. side and Chinese side drop this blame game? Because in the Chinese Foreign Ministry press conference this week, the spokesperson earlier said, we hope that the U.S. will work with China and a larger international community to jointly fight against the pandemic and safeguard the global public health security. Mr. Wang, what evidence are you seeing that the two sides will drop this blame game and come together perhaps to fight this virus? And what's at stake if they don't?
Before that, I want to add something to Einar. That's absolutely right.
Sure.
You know, the media has just amplified the ugliness of the societies. It's not the point. Now we have to focus on moving forward. And the reports, like you mentioned, the Financial Times, when China helps these countries, providing medical supplies, they painted it as China's power play. That is not helpful. Over the past 2-3 weeks, you've read some of the spokesperson's tweets. It is also a fundamental change here in Beijing about how we deal with this constant hostility out of Washington, and that they're going all out. They're going to push back. They're no longer avoiding, issues with regard to ideology that has to do with, the role of media in different societies. I don't want to be too optimistic about this, because the stance in Washington has not changed about how they view China. So the overall, overall direction of the China-U.S. relationship, a more confrontational, if I have to use that word, is not going to change temporarily because of a phone call. Still, we're seeking to pursue a more constructive dialogue, but it seems it's getting very, very hard, as Washington continues this rhetoric.
Yeah, none of these confrontations or hostilities is constructive, because after all, we're in this fight together. We're going to have to leave it here. Thank you very much, Thom Brooks, Dean and Professor of Law and Government at Durham Law School via Skype, and Mr. Wang, Chief Reporter at the Global Times here in Beijing, joining us on the phone, and also in Beijing, Einar Tangen, our current affairs commentator. And that's all for this edition of Headline Busters. As always, follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle @ThePointWithLX, and download the CGTN app to watch our show, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thank you for watching. Take care.